Is your motto mustn't grumble? Or is your default setting must grumble? Well, we often joke that mustn't grumble is a British trait, but if it ever was, I'm not sure it is now. These days, the national motto seems to be I'm not complaining, but let me just say this one thing. The nation grumbles at the state of the country and the inability of politicians to sort it out. The world grumbles at the lack of peace, at the problems of poverty, at the destruction of the environment. And we grumble when the tech we rely on just doesn't do what it's supposed to. Anyone being close to throwing the laptop or the iPad out the window if it doesn't cooperate. And we live in a complaining culture. Feedback forms are everywhere. You can't buy a sandwich without being asked to rate your overall emotional journey. And a few years ago, I gained a reputation with my family for complaining about poor service in shops. If I didn't get satisfaction, I'd say, "Who's in charge here? Call for the manager." My family found this highly embarrassing. They thought mustn't grumble ought to be my motto. I thought I was simply providing a public service. At work, it's not unusual to have complaints made against you, maybe unfairly. Whole departments exist to handle complaints. As a manager, I had the difficult job of trying to deal with complaints made against colleagues and work out whether they were being hard done to or whether the complainer really had a point. Well, in Numbers 11, we have two kinds of complaints with different outcomes. Complaining, it turns out, has its rights and wrongs. When it comes to God, there is the wrong kind of complaint and there is the right kind of complaint. How do we tell the difference? Well, first we get the wrong kind of complaint, the wrong kind of grumbling. Just to set the scene, Israel has escaped from Egypt, crossed the Red Sea on dry land, and met God at Mount Sinai. There, the people entered into covenant with him. They built the tabernacle, installed the priests, and are now instructed to march in order towards the promised land. The Lord himself, as we were thinking about last time, leads them by a cloud. And the land flowing with milk and honey is now within reach, possibly only a few months away. We read in the previous chapter that the Lord has promised good things to Israel. So we might expect morale will be high. You'd think they'll be singing songs of joy. You'd think they'd be saying, well, at least it's not Egypt as we wander through this wilderness. But no. 3 days into the march, they begin to complain. Verse 1. Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. God intends good for them, but all they can see is the hardships of the journey. Living in tents with no permanent home, the cry of "Are we there yet?" from the children on a long journey, a harsh, hot, desert environment with little water, and as we'll see, a limited variety in the diet. Now, some people enjoy camping, but most of us only do it for a week before returning to home comforts. We spent one night in a tent in the Sahara Desert in Morocco. There were two options: budget and luxury. Well, we didn't think about it for very long. The luxury version was for us. At our age, we thought we ought to go for it. Ensuite, a real bed, and meals laid on. All very nice. Israel, however, is experiencing the very budget option, and the novelty has worn off. But their grumbling angers the Lord, and fire breaks out on the edges of the camp. Of course, that's one way to deal with complaints. Imagine if shops did that. customer service queues will be very short. Why was God angry? Because their complaint revealed a distinct lack of trust in him and a considerable lack of gratitude. God had rescued them from the suffering of slavery in Egypt. He'd miraculously saved them from the Egyptians who pursued them through the Red Sea. He brought them into covenant relationship with him. He said he'd graciously be their God. They would be his people. He promised them this land flowing with milk and honey. All this was in their grasp. Yes, life was tough in the wilderness, but wasn't he providing for them? Wasn't he guiding them, keeping watch over them? Surely they could put up with some temporary hardship. But it doesn't stop there. Despite warning judgment from God, the next thing we read in verse 4 is this: the rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. They crave meat. They reminisce about Egypt as if it had been a five-star resort. Remember the fish, the cucumbers, the melons. And they conveniently forget the small detail of the brutal slavery. And again, God responds in anger. The problem is not the menu, it is their heart. Moses tells the people in verse 20, you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? The complaint is not about food. It is a rejection of God's salvation and his future for them. Now, hopefully, most of you are seeing some parallels here with the Christian life. We too have been saved by God's mighty power through his Son, Jesus Christ. We too live in a world that can feel at times like a wilderness, with its temptations and hardships and sufferings. And we too are in covenant relationship with God through Christ. We too are led and guided by God and blessed with every spiritual blessing. And we too are heading for the promised land, the new Jerusalem, the new heaven and the new earth, when Christ returns and makes all things new. And we too can moan and grumble, showing a distinct lack of gratitude for God's leading and provision, especially when things get tough. Paul in the New Testament recognized this, and he's therefore always encouraging Christian churches that he writes to get the Christian life into perspective. First, following Jesus is costly. Jesus calls us to take up our cross, and that means dying to self-centeredness and putting God at the center of our lives instead of ourselves. It may involve sacrifice, ridicule, or hardship. So should we complain if this is what we have signed up for? And secondly, we are to cultivate contentment. Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. This was Paul's lived experience. He endured beatings, imprisonments, hunger, shipwrecks, stoning. And that's not to mention what he calls his thorn in the flesh, which he asked to be removed, but the Lord told him he had to endure it because God's power is made perfect in Paul's weakness. This is what Paul said in personal testimony to the church in Philippi, Phil 4:12. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in every and any situation. If anyone had reason to complain, it was Paul. Yet he learned contentment. So we've looked at the complaining and grumbling of Israel. Well, now let's think about Moses' complaint. The right kind of grumbling. Verse 10 says Moses was troubled. He understands why God would be angered by the people's wailing and their ingratitude for what God had provided for them. But Moses himself is overwhelmed. He turns to God and he pours out his frustration. Why have you given me this burden? What have I done to displease you? How can I carry these people? Where am I supposed to get meat for them? I can't do this anymore. Now, some might regard the way that he doubts God and the impertinence in his tone to be just wrong. And some commentators criticize him and expect him to respond in a more deferential way. And no doubt that might have been possible. Maybe he could or should have adopted a different tone. But Moses is under immense pressure with the burden of leadership. And he is not joining the people's complaint about meat. In fact, it greatly troubles him that the people are not content with God's provision. And his outpouring of frustration and self-doubt is something I think many of us can perhaps identify with. What he does is bring his heavy burden to God. He doesn't turn away from God and brood to himself. He pours out his heart to God. And notice this in verse 11. He is still God's servant. He's not abandoned his loyalty to the Lord. Moses gets into such a state that he tells the Lord that it would be better if God were to kill him rather than go on and face his own ruin as he fails to cope. It would be an act of mercy. Now, maybe there is a bit of hyperbole in what Moses says, but there's no doubt that he's nearing what we might call today a mental health breakdown. And maybe some of you here have got to such a point when things just become too much to bear. Anyone who's faced heavy burdens that they thought they could not bear knows exactly how Moses feels. This might be the burdens of Christian leadership, which have brought intolerable pressure. As a church leader myself, there have been times when I've felt the burden it is too great. What does the Lord expect of me? It'd be so much easier if I could just give it all up. And also, as a middle manager at the school where I worked, I had to face the burden of responsibility for those I was meant to lead, whilst at the same time feeling the pressure from managers above, pushing to do some things that I felt were unreasonable. At times it didn't seem tolerable. I remember in the early years as a manager feeling the back of my neck aching, even though I was bearing no physical load. It was the psychological pressure. And this is where the prayer of lament comes in. There are a number of psalms where the psalmist cries out to the Lord to end the pressures and burdens he faces. But the psalmist retains an underlying trust in the Lord. Psalm 13 is an example. The cry goes up, "How long, O Lord?" It can sometimes be right to say to the Lord that it is too much to bear, that you've reached the end of what you can endure, to pour out your heart in your distress. But at the same time, trusting in the Lord. To say, you remain his servant. And that's what distinguishes Moses' complaint from Israel's. First, Moses brings his complaint to the Lord. Israel complained about God, and Moses complained to God. If we're going to complain, we need to bring our complaint to the Lord, pouring out our hearts in our desperate distress. As Peter says in 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Moses did this, but Israel often did not. And secondly, Moses maintained his trust in the Lord. Israel rejected God, but Moses remained God's servant. If we're going to complain, we need to keep our underlying trust in God and remain his servant. That's the right way to complain to God. Well, how does God answer these two complaints? Well, first look at the response to the people's complaint about the lack of meat. The Lord had answered the people's initial complaints by sending fire on the outskirts of the camp, and the people ignored that warning judgment. And now he promises meat, so much meat, that it will come out of their nostrils. Moses doubts how this is possible, but God replies, "Is the Lord's arm too short? It will happen, as he said." If God says it will happen, then it surely will. He keeps his word, even when he has said what he said seems beyond the bounds of credibility. He is able. And as God promised, meat is provided. More quail are blown in from the sea than it would be possible to eat. 3 feet deep and miles around the camp, the people gathered huge amounts of quail, tons and tons of it. It's the world's first all-you-can-eat buffet, and they certainly do. But then comes the sting in the tail. And with it, God is saying, be careful what you wish for. A plague breaks out among them, and some of them die. We don't know what disease or illness this was. It may have been connected with eating the meat itself or causing them to be physically ill. But we do know that God's anger burned against them because they had wailed for meat and wished they had never fled or left Egypt. Their complaining rejected God's goodness and his gracious and lavish plan for their good. So although God is gracious in supplying them with meat, indeed more meat than they can stomach, he also punishes them for their rejection of him. And that's a warning. They tragically continue to ignore as we move on through the book of Numbers. 1,000 or so years later, Paul warned the Corinthians, the church at Corinth, not to grumble as Israel did. Christians in Paul's day were complaining, and unfortunately not much has changed. He says this in 1 Corinthians 10:10, "Don't grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel." It's a warning to them, and it's a warning to us. But what about Moses' complaint? How does God respond to that? It's important to recognize that there seems to be no element of judgment in God's answer. Moses has a genuine problem with the burden of leadership, and 70 leaders already known to Moses were to gather at the tabernacle. The Lord would then come down, speak to Moses, and take some of the power of the Spirit from Moses and place it on the 70. And the elders would then be empowered to share in the burden of leadership. Moses is no longer to be alone. Sure enough, this happened, and the Spirit rested on them, and the chosen men prophesied. And we're told in verse 25 this is a kind of one-off experience. And however this phenomena was expressed, it would give them a sense that God had empowered them to lead on his behalf. We're not told the words they uttered. That's perhaps not the important thing, but the experience was important because those around them witnessed it. It was clear that these 70 were approved by God. So the Lord responds graciously to Moses' complaint with a practical solution to the burden of leadership. And with the Lord's help and power, others will share the burden with him. God does answer his complaint. And this time there is no sting in the tail, but there is perhaps a twist. 2 of the elders remained in the camp, but they also received the Spirit and prophesied. We're not told why they didn't come to the main event. Was it reluctance for some reason, or were they indisposed with legitimate excuse? The reaction of Joshua might indicate a lack of cooperation. If they'd been genuinely indisposed, maybe Joshua would have been more positive. And so we have a further grumble. This time it is Joshua. Joshua fears that Moses' leadership is being challenged or undermined by these two men. He's jealous for Moses' reputation and thinks the two men should be stopped. But Moses is magnanimous. If this is the work of God, why should he, Moses, be threatened? Paul displays a similar attitude when he wrote to the Philippian church. Some people were preaching the gospel with envy and rivalry and selfish ambition in their hearts. But Paul doesn't condemn them. He rejoiced that the gospel was being preached. Of course, he'd prefer the gospel were preached out of pure motive, but if the true gospel is preached, even if the motives are not quite right, he's not going to become jealous and envious. And Moses' reaction is to embrace what has happened and wish that all God's people were prophets and received his spirit. Wouldn't it be great if all God's people received his spirit and the gifts of the spirit? Not just some select few, those 70, just the leaders of God's people, but all God's people. Well, of course, Moses' words anticipate, whether he realized it or not, the day when all God's people would indeed receive God's Spirit in fulfillment of a later prophet, Joel. They'd receive God's Spirit on the day of Pentecost. And now all God's people do receive the Spirit. And just think how much more grumbling and complaining we would do without the Spirit. So let me conclude. Numbers 11 shows us two contrasting complaints. The grumbling that rejects God's goodness and forgets the cost of following him, and the honest lament that brings our burdens to God. Moses longed for a day when all God's people would have God's Spirit, and in Christ that day has come. So as we journey through our own wilderness, may we resist the complaints and grumbling that blind us to God's goodness. May we bring our struggles honestly to him. And may we live as spirit-filled people who trust him, thank him, walking forward in the strength he supplies, even when the menu isn't what we hope for. And if you ever feel tempted to complain, remember, at least you're not knee-deep in quail.